When it comes to debates or conversations about the existence of God, the unfortunate reality is that often these discussions have little to do with God's existence. And to help you see the point that I'm trying to make and actually give you an example of this, I want to break down an interview between Richard Dawkins and Joe Rogan. And if you're not familiar, Richard Dawkins is an atheist, so he believes that God doesn't exist. And he's actually the best-selling author of The God Delusion, which, as the name implies, he's trying to show that belief in God is delusional. A little while back, he was interviewed on Joe Rogan in part to promote his new book, Outgrowing God, which is like The God Delusion, but it's more geared and aimed at children or young people. And even though this interview wasn't super recent, I still wanted to take a look at it kind of for two reasons. And the first is just that these people are massively popular. Richard Dawkins is perhaps the world's most famous atheist. Joe Rogan is one of the world's most well-known podcasters. And so this interview has had a great impact. But secondly, and probably more importantly, I think that this interview really highlights some of the very common problems that and poor thinking that plague our debates about God's existence. So let's start by looking at the outline of Dawkins' case that he presents in his new book, Outgrowing God.
Now, when you set out to write this book and write it for young people, how did you structure it in your mind? Did you think of it as addressing young people with questions that are trying to find?
Sort of, yes. It's in two halves. The first half is debunking God. It begins with what we were talking about earlier, the sheer number of different gods.
They actually harped a decent amount on this point throughout the interview, that there are so many different religions out there. There are so many different ways over the years that people have conceived about God, yet nothing actually follows from this point. I'm not exactly sure how Richard Dawkins thinks that this debunks God. His argument effectively comes down to there are a lot of different religions out there, therefore God doesn't exist. And I would love to see how he bridges that gap, because this is a clear example of an invalid argument. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. And beyond this, it's pretty ironic that there are actually a lot of different ways that people flesh out atheism. So for example, almost no two atheists agree on the evolutionary path that has led us to the diversity of life that we see today. Atheists disagree on whether morality is objective or not. And if it is, what's the basis for that? There's huge disagreement among atheists on how we explain the existence of or origins of the universe. And so, yeah, there's a lot of diversity in religion and how people view God, but there's also a great diversity in how people view atheism. And so I guess by Richard Dawkins' standards, would this also debunk atheism itself?
And then moves on to the Bible and how unreliable a source of information it is. And both the Old Testament and the New Testament, they get a chapter each.
Dawkins has made his distaste for the Bible very clear over his career, but this is a very strange way to go about debunking God. First of all, I think that his assessment about the Bible is false, but even if his criticisms hold true, at best, that would show that the Bible is flawed. It would say nothing about God's existence. Maybe the Bible is just an inaccurate representation of God, or maybe a whole different God exists, like the God of Islam. And so I want you to see this consistent pattern where his conclusions don't actually follow from his arguments.
And then there's a couple of chapters on morality and why you don't need, or not only do you not need religion to be moral, you better not have religion if you want to be moral.
Dawkins repeatedly misrepresents what's actually being argued for when it comes to God and morality. No one is saying that you have to be religious or that you even have to believe in God to be a moral person. The argument is that without God's existence, there just can be no objective morality because there's no foundation for this. And nowhere here does Dawkins undermine this. In fact, in his previous work, like his book, River Out of Eden, he himself actually makes this point.
And then the second half of the book is about science, because I think that one of the, possibly the major reason people still cling to religion is a belief that the world is so complicated, especially the living world is so complicated that it cannot be explained by purely scientific means. And so I've set out to disabuse them of that and to show how even the most radically complicated and beautiful and elegant pieces of animal design can be and are explained by science.
So here Dawkins takes aim at design arguments for God's existence. And this has really been the bulk of his work in general. And what he's trying to argue is that these things that we tend to look at as designed in nature really aren't designed at all, and therefore you don't need a designer. And I think it's interesting to note that even Dawkins can't avoid the language of design. He calls these things pieces of animal design, whereas what he's trying to say is that these aren't designed at all, but can be explained naturalistically through evolution. But beyond that, he doesn't really do anything to undermine design arguments for God's existence. And in a big part because these arguments have become a lot more powerful over the last 60 or 70 years. Yeah, we've seen what looks like clear design in biological life, but we've also seen stunning discoveries that seem to imply design in the very structure or makeup of the universe itself. The universe is set up perfectly for life to even be possible, and no evolutionary arguments will undermine this because this is no longer biology. Now this has to do with cosmology and physics. And none of this is to mention that there are dozens of sound arguments for God's existence that have nothing to do with design at all. There's obviously a lot more that they talked about, which we just don't have time to cover. And so I want to end with just some big picture problems that I think repeatedly crop up, not only in this interview, but really in these types of discussions in general. And the first is one that we've already seen, and it's that so often when people go about debunking God, the conclusions that they're drawing don't actually follow from the arguments that they're making. And so whether it's there are just so many different ideas out there about God, or Dawkins and Rogan's favorite that we're all actually atheists. We're just atheists with respect to other gods like Zeus and Thor. Even if these things are true, you can't actually conclude anything about God's existence from this. Second, as I hinted at the very beginning, so often these discussions about God's existence end up not actually being discussions about God at all. Instead, the conversation turns to become a discussion about people who believe in God. And so really throughout this whole interview, it was just assumed that God doesn't exist and that belief in him is absurd. And then they talked about evolutionary or psychological reasons why people believe in things like God. And so maybe Rogan would ask Dawkins, why do you think people just hold on to religious beliefs or beliefs about God? The problem here is that once again, nothing about God's existence actually follows from this. Take statements about my personal psychology. Maybe it's true that the only reason I believe in God is because this is a comforting belief. Or statements about our evolutionary development. Maybe it's true that the only reason we believe in God is because this belief has helped us survive in the past. Whether these things are true or not, this does nothing to disprove whether God actually exists out there in reality. Those are statements about me, not about God. The last point that I want to make is that the people who we view here as experts just aren't really experts. And I'm not exactly sure why we even care so much about what scientists like Richard Dawkins even think about God's existence. The question of God's existence is a metaphysical question, so it falls in the area of philosophy, not science. Science, by definition, studies the natural world, where God, by definition, is supernatural or outside of nature. And so this is really outside of Dawkins's field of expertise, or even Rogan's field of expertise for that matter. And this is why you see them repeatedly making what are really elementary mistakes in logic. And so I do hope that this breakdown was helpful, and whether you're a skeptic or a believer, that it leads ultimately to more productive conversations about a very important subject.